I'm Wesley Lucas, librarian at the National World War II Museum, and this is another book event for our official book club, Read to Win the War. For our third selection, we are doing our first novel, Slaughterhouse-Five by Kurt Vonnegut. And to discuss this book today, we've invited two panelists. Chris Lafave is curator at the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library. Hey, Chris, thanks for joining us.
No problem.
That museum is in Indianapolis, Indiana, and it is definitely a pretty cool place, so we will talk about that more. And also joining us from the National World War II Museum here in New Orleans is Assistant Director for Curatorial Services, Kim Guise. Hey, Kim.
Hi.
And yeah, so, we've got, some literary background, we've got some military history background here, and we're going to dive right in. Love this book for so many reasons, and it's got so much going on with it. But I think one way to start would be, Chris, if you don't mind, maybe telling us about Kurt Vonnegut a little bit, just a little bit of his background leading up to the war, and then maybe some of his experience there so we know a little bit about Kurt.
Well, thanks, Wesley, for that introduction. Yeah, Kurt Vonnegut's life is a story I find really, really interesting, largely because it's a study in contradictions to a certain degree. Kurt's great-grandfather, Clemens Vonnegut, came here to Indianapolis from Westphalia, Germany, and founded a company called Vonnegut Hardware Store. Now, off the top of your head, that doesn't sound very sexy, but it stayed a really, really powerful family business for something like 125 years. And the reason I mention that is because Kurt's great-grandfather was a major civic leader, was involved in politics, critical of organized religion, and he had children. The grandfather was a really prominent architect here, Bernard Vonnegut. Kurt's father, Kurt Vonnegut Sr., was also a prominent architect here. And by the time he married Edith Lieber of the Lieber beer family in 1912, it was arguably the most expensive wedding in Indianapolis history up until that point. Their honeymoons, trip around the world, and the Great Depression and Prohibition kind of combined to put an end to that sort of lavish lifestyle. That being said, I don't want to describe it as though the Vonneguts were living in cardboard boxes like 30% of America. They were doing okay, and Vonnegut went to Shortridge High School, which is a very renowned high school here. He played clarinet in the jazz band badly and was one of the editors of the school paper. And because of that, because in 1936, 37, 38, 39, not a lot of high schools in America had daily newspapers. He was offered a job at the Indianapolis Times right out of high school. And his family talked him out of accepting it. They said, "You'll never make a living as a writer." Kurt's father in particular had a lot of animosity built up towards the arts and humanities, thanks to what happened in the Depression. And so even though Kurt spent a summer at Butler studying journalism, where the professor said you write at a sophomoric level, and Kurt said, "That's good, I'm only a freshman," Kurt did go to Cornell primarily, where he studied chemistry and got terrible grades. He called it a beer-soaked time. He was a member of the fraternity Delta Upsilon. The reason I'm going through all of this kind of step by step is that in Kurt's junior year, he got pneumonia. Missed a whole lot of class, wasn't in a huge rush to go back. Cornell was in no major rush to have him back. And with his relationship with his school sweetheart, Jane Cox, a woman that he actually met in elementary school and was a family friend, their relationship was kind of on the rocks. Jane was incredibly ambitious and hardworking and brilliant, and Kurt was kind of adrift to a certain degree. And he ended up joining the Army in the middle of his junior year. The Army sent him to Carnegie and the University of Tennessee for heavy artillery training that he would not use during the war. All told, we think he came very close to getting a degree in engineering from the University of Tennessee, and that's when the Army finally summoned him back to the 106th Division in southern Indiana. Long story short, he does not end up in the European theater until, November of 1944. That's really towards the end of the war, where 6'2" lanky Vonnegut, who's been to 4 colleges, finds himself in World War II. Just the really interesting events in his life, to being captured nearly immediately at the Battle of the Bulge and taken to Dresden, where he survived the bombing. Like that, I think that left him truly feeling unstuck in time. with what we would call combat trauma today. That answer was really long. I'll let you.
No, that's exactly what we're shooting for. We're trying to get some good background here, and that's perfect. So it's interesting to see how his life trajectory led him into being in the service, in the war, and also his background with writing and how it all came together. So for a little more background, I'm going to ask Kim, this period of time that Chris just mentioned, he only gets to Europe towards the end of 44, and obviously there's only going to be about 6 or 7 months left in the war there. But there's still lots of really hard fighting to do. So could you set us up for that period of the war, and then maybe also segue into the POW experience, because obviously he becomes a POW and the story revolves around that experience.
Sure. So when Vonnegut arrived, his situation was not unlike many others who were destined to be replacements essentially in the European theater. So, in the early winter and throughout the winter of 44 and into 45, the Germans were, giving it all they had at the very end, and in what became known as the Battle of the Bulge. And so Vonnegut arrived as part of that, cadre, I guess, of men who were untried in combat. They were often placed in, within other regiments, and they were not able to form, the kinds of relationships that others had known earlier, that we think of with, say, Band of Brothers, where people are together and they form these cohesive units, perhaps. In Vonnegut's situation, many of the men who arrived in the European theater towards the end of the war, were tossed into units, to fill in for losses, certainly. And, their experience was very different from others. So, and many Americans were captured during the Battle of the Bulge, like Vonnegut. So overall in the European theater, we had around 93,000 POWs. And if you managed to make it into a POW camp in Europe as an American, your chances of survival were pretty good. But every person had a different experience depending on when you were captured, depending on who captured you, and the situation of the war, the time of the war. And so, the average length of captivity in the European theater was 1 year. So, Vonnegut was on the shorter end of that experience, certainly. But initially, most American POWs, until really the period of the Bulge, most American POWs were airmen. So of course, that's how they were captured. They were flying over, bombing German-held territory, and having to bail out, or being shot out of the sky by flaks. So most American POWs initially were airmen, and again, many of those men were held for a long time. As I said, the average length of captivity was 1 year, and so some of them in the larger camps, there were about 100 camps scattered throughout Germany. Some of them were able to form these, cohesive units and form, a camp culture almost in some of the larger camps, like, the ones that, Stalag-Luft 1 or Stalag-Luft 3, where the Great Escape happened. Not that those were glamorous situations, but it was very different from what ended up being Vonnegut's experience. And that's, partially due to his rank. So the Germans typically adhered to the principles of the Geneva Convention when, in relation to prisoners of war, when you talk about American POWs or Allied POWs. And So, there were certain things that Allied POWs were afforded by those principles. And it was, you were allowed to notify your family or the Red Cross through the Red Cross that you were held prisoner. And sometimes at the end, for guys that were captured at the end of the war, like Vonnegut, sometimes, they were freed before their family even heard that they were held in a camp. So, the time period, towards the end of the war, those kinds of I guess, rights afforded to American POWs by the Geneva Convention began to break down. Another thing that American POWs were allowed to do that was elect a representative. So a mediator, that would talk to the German officials, but also talk with Red Cross and YMCA officials. And that comes up a little bit with Vonnegut, so we can talk about that later. But another thing was also officers were not required to perform physical labor. And, that's very important in the POW story overall in the European theater. But it does come into play with Vonnegut's story. So enlisted men were required to work. They were supposed to receive some payment in return for that work. But, that how that was conducted was a little loose. So, the men who were on work detachments were typically enlisted men who, were in smaller groups than these organized camps that had, a more established network of Red Cross intervention, of Red Cross aid. And we see all of those things in Slaughterhouse-Five. So don't want to give too much away or go on too long. Were there any other questions, Wes or Chris, that you had in particular about the American POW experience in Europe?
Well, that is excellent background and sort of a general experience for, Americans who were captured in Europe, compared to other theaters. And so it kind of gives you a little bit of a feel for what Kurt might have gone through, and also at that point in time, with the war winding down, but excuse me, with the Battle of the Bulge raging. So, Chris, I was going to ask, what can you tell us about, Kurt's actual experience? Any letters he wrote about it, or any memories of it after the war he discussed?
There's it's in the beginning of the collection of essays and short stories, Armageddon in Retrospect. If you turn to the beginning of it, there's a very, very PTSD-drenched letter that he wrote from the camp in Paris after he'd been liberated, where he is telling his family, this is what happened. Now, we do know a little bit that one of the most fascinating things we have in the museum is this letter that Kurt Vonnegut's father wrote to him during the war. It's dated November of 1944, and the note on the front from a lieutenant says, missing January 7th, 1945. So at some point, the family was informed that he was missing in action. That was followed, we believe, by a Western Union telegram informing them that he was indeed a prisoner of war, because we have a letter written by Alice Vonnegut, who is Kurt's older sister and very, very close to Kurt. And it's a letter to Kurt's older brother, Bernard, who was living outside of Indianapolis at the time, letting him know that Kurt was fundamentally okay, or as okay as could be at the time. So it's a very happy letter. It's a very overjoyed. He's not missing in action. He's captured by the Nazis, which I think would be a complicated, joyful moment. But yeah, that's the primary thing that we have. So you were saying notes on his experience. I mean, I guess his initial impression of Dresden. I mean, I think the train ride, having been captured, and the train ride taking a really long time while human beings are like piled on top of each other like cattle and barfing, and it's a rather graphic part of the novel Slaughterhouse-Five, and a highly accurate one. The death of Roland Weary, what have you. It's a very ugly and horrible experience. So I can imagine seeing what he called the world's most beautiful city, or possibly the world's most beautiful city, probably felt like a relief. And while we know that he had to work, they were working in a factory making prenatal syrup, and they were on the verge of starving, and they needed to, steal some of that syrup to stay alive and get some much needed nutrients. That doesn't sound like a very pleasant life experience. Of course, the penalty for theft was extreme and sometimes death. Then, of course, they did elect Vonnegut to be the leader of the prisoners because he spoke broken German, and Vonnegut did lose his temper one night and threatened to beat the crap out of. He threatened them with what he was going to do to them when the Russians arrived, and they beat the heck out of Vonnegut, and then he wasn't the leader of the prisoners after that. So he had some very unusual stories from the pre-bombing time frame, and then of course the night of the bombing. That's very, very graphically described in Slaughterhouse-Five, where he talks about how it sounded like giants walking on the ceiling, and the giants walked and walked. There's another moment in Man Without a Country, the last collection of essays before he died, where he talks about how another prisoner said, I wonder what the poor people are doing right now." Huh. And he was like, that in his mind, that was such a beautiful statement, although it's kind of haunting too. The biggest thing is Billy Pilgrim is based on a character named a person named Ed Crone, a real life person who was, I don't know whether PTSD would be the proper diagnosis. I believe that the combat he had witnessed had rendered him virtually catatonic, refusing to eat and bathe and care for himself. And I think he just died of like maybe a semi non-consensual hunger strike. Like that's kind of what he seemed to pass from. And I think the soldiers bullying him weren't always necessarily Germans. And so I think Vonnegut walked around carrying a lot of survivor's guilt in regards to Ed Crone. And so he is more or less the basis for the character Billy Pilgrim.
Well, that is an interesting transition to talking about the book itself and how it compares to real life, of course. And I was certainly curious about the character of Billy Pilgrim because you wonder how much of himself is in it, but of course you just pointed out that he was based on another soldier that he knew. Does he at all, sort of mix it with his own experiences? Because obviously the bombing and the POW camp and stuff were things that he experienced. And
yeah, he throws himself in there, especially in the scene where he eats too much of the extra British rations in the earlier camp. He excreted his brains out. Like that was me. That was the author of this book. I love that line.
Right. Yeah, I like how he. Go ahead, Chris.
There's a lot of nonfiction in the novel. He acknowledges that he knew someone who threatened to have his personal enemies killed, which is hard to think that Paul Lazzaro is a somewhat non-fictional character. So you're really glad you didn't come across that guy in your life.
Right. Yeah, go ahead, Kim.
One of the things that I think is so interesting, about the POW experience is that, and about, I guess, the experience of service in general is that you were thrown into the situation with so many other different types of humans, any type of person that you can imagine. There were, there were bullies, of course, but there were also people like Billy Pilgrim or, so there was, every type of person that you could dream up and not one uniform type person. And I, in thinking about what the typical soldier, what you think of as the typical soldier or the typical experience of someone fighting, or in the war, do you think of someone, who do you picture in your head? And Vonnegut plays with that so, beautifully in terms of like, especially in the beginning, I think with the scouts and with the Three Musketeers, and, what people, even, Roland, what he thinks of of himself. You know, he's playing, you know, a character of what he imagines a soldier to be.
Yeah.
And so I just, I, I love that aspect of the novel.
I think
I,
that's
I
a
I love it too. I think the beginning of the novel is an all-time favorite of mine. It pissed off the censors something awful, that early line. Am I able to cuss here, or do I have to censor the wording?
no, you're good.
Okay, because there's that line where he yells, "Get out of the road, you dumb motherfucker!" Because Billy Pilgrim is walking down the road in a trance, and there's snipers firing, and he doesn't bother to move, or he can't. And Vonnegut has a quote where he said the powers that be thought this line was pornographic way back in 1969. Ever since that novel was published way back in '69, children have been attempting to have intercourse with their mothers. When it will stop, nobody knows. Uh, I've always loved that line, but it's so important, the cussing in that scenario, because like the unbelievable amount of Vonnegut somehow writes humor and grace and humanity into this incredibly scary and tense scene, taking place by malnourished, underdressed, middle of winter northern Belgium scene where these two hard soldiers don't say a word until they ditch them. And I love the character of Roland Weary, because I think he probably represents a lot of people in their mindset. They're like, oh, this is going to be when I come back with all my medals and with these brothers that I never had in the real world. It's like I'm going to feel so good when I never have to pay for a beer again, and the women, they flock to me. And just the unbelievably sad fall from grace from that mentality. Which he, of course, blames on Billy Pilgrim, who's pretty blameless in the situation.
Right. Well, that's another good part about that first chapter you mentioned, where it's kind of meta, where he's injecting himself into the story, Kurt Vonnegut, and he encounters a couple of different people who find out he's writing, a book about his experience in the war, and he gets critical responses from people saying, "Oh, are you going to do another glorified war story where you just have a big war hero and it's all kind of not realistic?" And then, the wife of his friend, kind of calls him out and says, "Don't pretend y'all were all men over there. You were just babies." And so that's where the subtitle Children's Crusade comes from. And so, I was definitely interested in hearing y'all's opinion about that, about this being, whether it's anti-war or not, he's definitely created an anti-hero, like, counter narrative to the whole heroic American soldier story. So, like, what do y'all think about that notion?
Well,
Go ahead, Kim.
I mean, I think we see a lot of that in the POW story in general, of how POWs, how prisoners of war and those who are captured are viewed in traditional war narratives, and there are incredibly sad stories of men returning home from camps and either viewing themselves as less of a person, less of a hero, less of a veteran, because they were in camp, or prisoners returning home. And there's one story that we have in our archives and we have oral histories that we present online, and we have one by a man named Anthony Acevedo, who was Mexican American, and he was captured and was actually sent to Berga concentration camp. So he has a little bit of a very different story, as every single individual does. But when he returned home, his father, said, what kind of man are you? You let yourself be captured. That's, you're no man. So, I think, to imagine to have survived this experience and then to return home and be confronted with that kind of attitude is just heart-wrenching. But I forgot where I was going with that.
We were just talking about it being kind of that sort of counter narrative to that, that that hero trope, in U.S. military history. It's more about creating this image of regular people who were flawed in different ways fighting the same war.
Yeah. Chris, you want to take it away?
I think it's an unbelievably powerful statement by a guy who struggled with the trauma of what he went through all his life. And that's not unique to Kurt Vonnegut in any way, shape, or form. I think that's true of so many veterans, many of whom I've met. Like when they come in here, I know I said in my pre-interview there was a guy who came in with his mother, and his mother was a survivor of the bombing of Dresden, and he was a Vietnam veteran. And there was a line there where I don't know how to talk about because, Vonnegut received the Purple Heart, which he said he won for frostbite and called a ludicrously negligible wound. Now, I know the military says it's got to be an actual inaction wound. I'm not really sure how that came about. So I was saying, I don't know for sure whether it was Vonnegut himself who had his boots removed. I know they all had improper or poorly taken care of footwear. But it was, I was trying to tamper that down when the Vietnam veteran immediately turned to me and said, "Oh, we did that all the time." Don't get me wrong, if somebody has shoes and you don't, you're taking their shoes.
Right.
And the black and white horror of that, and knowing that Vonnegut had been through that, and sitting there in my relative comfort, knowing that I've probably never in my life been out in the snow with no shoes on, let alone been marched with a gun to my back 60 miles. That was just the beginning, of his experience. So, I mean, the beginning of the novel speaks very loudly to me about what he was trying to say in the first place, and then Mary O'Hara, of course, gave him quite a nudge about the morality of what he was trying to say, and saying, "I have babies." And the more you push this idiotic narrative that you weren't babies, that you were heroic, powerful, godlike men, the more people are going to push my babies and other babies off to war. And it ends in the end of the novel where he talks about Martin Luther King was shot, Robert F. Kennedy was shot, so it goes. My father was a sweet old man. He died of natural causes. He left me his guns. They rust. He was trying to say something very aggressive about that, and about there's a sadness there that I think is overwhelming. The novel is funny in parts, of course, but overall, Slaughterhouse-Five is a challenging text.
That's excellent points, and that's exactly what I took from those first and last chapters as well. Is like,
I think they're the most important chapters. They're really important.
Yep.
Agreed. So, like, talking about, thinking about the trauma and coping with trauma, or how it's processed. The Vonneguts, or in Slaughterhouse-Five, the comments about, mustard gas and roses, and people veterans making phone calls, and drunken phone calls in the middle of the night. Those are, experiences that I've heard from others, answering the phone and having someone on the other line, who had served and was obviously drunk, so those are, experiences that I think, are very much out there still today. Those the phone lines, they're very different iPhones, or whatever. But yeah.
No, that is extremely interesting because that's he ended up dedicating the novel to two characters in the novel. Does that mean that Maureen O'Hara was actually the wife of a friend and he just changed the name, or did he just truly create that character and dedicate it to them?
No, Mary O'Hara is the name of Bernard O'Hara's wife, and so that's one of the dedications. The other dedication is Gerhard Mueller, who I may have mispronounced his name, and I apologize for that. But he was the cab driver that took Vonnegut and Bernard O'Hara to the Slaughterhouse-Five location. And when they went back to visit Dresden in 1967, and this was with Guggenheim money, they go into a little bit of detail in interviews and what have you about what that experience was like. I mean, first of all, they had to go behind the Iron Curtain in order to go there. And, it was weird. They would try to look up the family members of guards who survived and the guards themselves. And of course, they're afraid of the secret police, so they don't want to talk very much about their memories. It was a haunting experience in the first place. I also forgot where I was going with that, but yeah, Gerhard Muller, he said something about, I hope I see you again if the accident will.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, you know, Vonnegut invented the Tralfamadorians in 1959. So, and in fact, we have evidence that he invented it as a young child to impress his family over at Lake Maxinkuckee at their summer home, because, you know, the smallest child in a family of older people has to be funny in order to get attention. But yeah, so the Tralfamadorians were maybe even predate the war as the exploration of a guy who already struggled with the concept of free will and how much power do individual humans really have to create their own narrative, to be in charge of everything, to avoid terrifying experiences and awful things.
Right.
You know, I'm not sure he ever. I'm not sure he ever believed in free will, because in 1959, Sirens of Titan, he plays with the concept beautifully. And in 1997, when he's writing his last novel, Timequake, it's also on the subject of free will. So I think that one stayed. That one theme he could never let go of is the idea that we're not in control.
That's perfect, because I think you dropped that little, you know, quote that's ever present throughout the book. And so it goes, which is that fatalistic kind of concept. And I'll be interested to hear from both y'all, you know, about, you know, he creates those alien race to kind of juxtapose with humans' concept of time and space, whereas these aliens actually see everything at once and are okay with that. So it goes always comes up after like a senseless or ironic death or something. And so they're just like, that's how it goes. So Kim, you might be interested in talking about, like, you know, that trauma of prisoners of war, you know, is coping mechanism to be escapism, creating this other world and wanting to get into it. The character even gets obsessed with science fiction novels, you know. So that's something that you see as well in some of the stories in our oral histories here from POWs, and, you know, just these attempts to separate themselves from what they dealt with almost drastically by creating another world or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the Slaughterhouse-Five, you know, lends itself to a lot of different readings, but I view it all through the POW lens, which, you know, is my own personal, you know, read of it, I suppose. And, you know, I think for many prisoners of war, you know, one of the, they're, of course, you know, in a war against the enemy, but they're also fighting time. They're essentially waiting, you know, one of the prisoner of war newspapers in one of the camps was called POW, Prisoners of War Waiting on Winning. You know, and so essentially they're waiting the war out behind barbed wire is how a lot of people view that experience. And, you know, so it's a fight against the clock or a fight against the hourglass. And, you know, I think that ability, you know, some people coped with that experience by just sleeping, you know, and that kind of brought up the character of Ed Crone. You know, some people just, I mean, it's essentially, you know, extreme distress, you know, so depression, you know, they would just lie in bed and, you know, and try to sleep away that time. And they were referred to as sack artists, you know, they were excellent at sleeping. So, you know, that's one thing that, you know, one way of coping. But I think creating these other worlds, also, you know, being able to place yourself at a different time is also another way that people would cope with that experience.
That is super interesting. And it, you know, we're talking about Billy Pilgrim being based on this character or this actual soldier he knew, but Kurt himself had to take 20 years or so to come to be able to write this. So he obviously was dealing with his own trauma on this. and I'm throughout this, I was thinking about this. I think it's Viet Thanh Nguyen, the author of The Sympathizer, who's brought it up lately, but I'm not sure if he's paraphrasing someone else. But it's like wars are fought twice, first on the battlefield and then in memory. And so throughout this book, you're wondering about the time travel between his adult life in the 60s and, you know, his youth in the wartime. So I don't know. I wonder, Chris, if you have any, you know, insight on like, you know, Kurt's process of dealing with his own trauma over that 20-something year period and then trying to write it out.
Well, I've probably spent too much of my life thinking about it, to be honest. There's,
Yeah.
I guess it's weird because I relate it too much to other people too. I mean, like, you know, everyone has some kind of trauma in their life. Obviously, most of us don't go through our mother's death from alleged suicide on Mother's Day Eve, 6 months before we're shipped out to the Battle of the Bulge, then captured, then a survivor of the bombing in Dresden, burying the dead. Like, you know, that is not something that typically happens to someone within a year's time. So that's an extreme level of trauma.
Right.
But I noticed that like, you know, I think all human beings have moments where they wanted to stay and moments where they desperately wanted to go. And I think it's a very interesting and easily relatable, which is a criticism that Vonnegut, the author, ran into constantly throughout his life. Oh, why are you so easy to read? Oh, why are you so relatable? You don't have this 700-page incomprehensible manuscript in which somebody has to have a thesaurus sitting right next to the book in order to understand. You know, that was something that critics actively gave him a hard time about. And I think he was writing a very humanistic novel about something that I think a lot of people were fundamentally, even though nobody goes through that life experience, but people were able to relate to the idea of, God, wouldn't it be kind of nice, like time travel? Like, it could also be awful, because of course, when you don't have any free will, you'll be going to god awful moments in your life, but you'll also be able to return to the beautiful ones. And, you know, some of these beautiful moments in the novel include, like, the scene where Billy Pilgrim is watching the war movie backwards, and some bullets being ripped out of human beings and back into the guns, and bombs are coming out of the ground and back into the bombers, and the planes fly backwards back to these factories where the terrible weapons of war are disconstructed and turned back into minerals, and then they're buried in the ground by women, you know, which I don't know gender strata whether that would be approved today, but at the time it was this thought of this extreme act of peace, and it's one of those moments in the novel that feels very happy, along with some of Billy Pilgrim's time on Tralfamadore with Montana Wild Hag. Those scenes are portrayed so positively and so gentle and so safe. You know, so I think it's a reaction to combat trauma, but I think it's also a reaction to trauma in general. The idea that, you know, let's say you're an adult with a lot of responsibilities, which just about a ton of World War II veterans found themselves married with children, you know, a year or two after returning from the war, and very responsibility filled. You know, you might want to move every once in a while in your head to a moment where you were swimming or doing something very basic. I say that as a relatively new father.
Yeah.
I sometimes visit fish concerts in my mind.
You gotta keep that stuff somewhere.
Yeah, no kidding. I've been stuck in time as well.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, no, that is excellent context for this. I guess as well, you know, you think about the fact that he wrote this at the height of the Vietnam War, and naturally there's going to be that sort of allegory for it, or at least a point about, you know, war being something that probably shouldn't be so readily, you know, dissipating. But so I guess I'm thinking about the legacy of Dresden a little bit, you know, in terms of, you know, it gets overshadowed by the atomic bombs, you know, and that was obviously horrific as well. But it's like these were choices by the American military to, you know, attack, you know, civilian centers as opposed to military centers. So like, in the meta first chapter, he notes to his friend that they don't even actually remember a lot of details right off. Like it's almost like they blocked a lot of that out. And then when he starts looking into it, the Air Force didn't publish a lot of stuff initially. They kind of kept a lot of things classified. You know, when he discusses it with other vets and other friends, a lot of people don't even really remember it or mention it. So I don't know. I wonder about if either of y'all have any opinions on, you know, the legacy of Dresden, the context of Vietnam that he wrote it in, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, he started to write what we know as Slaughterhouse-Five. Like, I mean, he started it the second he came back from the war. He knew he wanted to write about it right away. But he'd been trained as a journalist, which meant to write as much as you know, as fast as you know. It started to look like a diary entry or a shopping list, and it just wasn't. He had no idea how he was going to craft an interesting narrative that somebody else would want to read. And so that scene that happened with Bernard and Mary O'Hare, and he gets the idea for the Children's Crusade, that took place in 1964. So it's a little bit before the Vietnam War heated up in extreme intensity. So the book kind of grew with the Vietnam War. So, I mean, the legacy of Dresden, honestly, I think before Slaughterhouse-Five came out, I would imagine not a lot of people were thinking about it. And then when Slaughterhouse-Five became the most famous book in the world for a while, it probably resurfaced as something people discussed a lot. I'm speaking from my own generation right now. I imagine, you know, I was 18 when 9/11 happened. I'm 37 now. Mm-hmm. And we still live in a state of constant perpetual war, which Vonnegut was alive to see. And if you read A Man Without a Country, there's no fictional pretense in that collection of essays. There's no doctoring things up. Everything's very, very, very literal. There's no Tralfamadorians. There is one line in that collection where he says the aliens have landed at the Hotel Waldorf in New York City. The good news is they eat homeless people and piss gasoline. And that's the closest thing to humor you'll find in some of his scathing commentary on the world of constant war in the name of fighting terrorism, which of course, like, it's very hard to vanquish the existence of people who feel, I don't even know how you would go about describing that, but I don't know what ends the war on terror. Right. And I think that's where Kurt found himself at the age of 84 when he died in 2007.
I think that's a lot of what, you know, makes this book still super relevant and makes museums like the National World War II Museum and Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library, you know, relevant institutions today, because they're teaching us lessons about our current situation. Yeah, and we've all kind of grown up in this 9/11 generation. It's definitely that exhaustion, you know, with always being in that state of war, you know. So
yeah, that's the very strange thing about my job. People ask, why is Vonnegut so incredibly relevant? Why hasn't his work aged or, you know, seemed dated or wooded? And I'm like, you know, it's kind of tragic in a sense. When you read God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, which, you know, was set about the haves and the have-nots with the backdrop of the Johnson-Goldwater election in the background, it's very easy to read that book as a book that Bernie Sanders probably puts underneath his pillow at night. You know, it's very, very easy to do that. It's very easy to read Cat's Cradle, which is a funny book about religion, weaponry, and the end of the world. It's very easy to read that book and think about the 9/11s and the Great Recessions and the COVID-19s and just go, man, you're really born into a world on fire, but your parents did too, and your grandparents, and like it's very hard to do anything other than acknowledge when you're happy and try to hold on to those moments. And Vonnegut was a super big proponent of that. And I think, you know, people, when they read that, they find truth in that. They go, you know, I really did enjoy that glass of lemonade last night. The fact that my wife has ice cream sandwiches in the freezer is awesome. Like, that, you know, it's these little things that you can get a lot of joy out of if you focus on them.
It's a really good point. It makes you think of his epitaph or whatever. Everything was beautiful and nothing hurt. You know, it's like, it's that escapist kind of fatalist mentality of this novel.
He had an uncle too, his Uncle Alex, who he was incredibly fond of. He was a Harvard graduate turned insurance salesman, and he was the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous in Indianapolis. And he was famous for saying, if this isn't nice, what is? And was just like a really positive person and someone Vonnegut cared for a great deal. He had a good uncle and then a bad uncle. The bad uncle was the one who said, "You're a real man now. You've been to war." And Kurt said, "I wanted to kill him. He would have been the only German I ever killed."
That's so perfect. So it looks like we have about, oh, go ahead, Kim.
Oh, I wanted to ask, one thing that we didn't cover, but our museum contains a lot of material that Americans brought home from the war, and that, as souvenirs. And sometimes they are, German, armbands or flags, certainly, or daggers. And I wanted to ask you, Chris, I know you have some of the memorabilia that Vonnegut brought home. Could you talk about a couple of those pieces in your collection?
Yeah, I mean, as far as things that Vonnegut brought home from the war, there's really only one. It's a German officer's saber that he brought home, which has a swastika on it, which it's still such a jarring image so many years later. We actually loaned that and the Purple Heart to the Military History Museum in Dresden. So if you've ever gone into FedEx at 11 o'clock at night on a Monday carrying a Nazi sword and a Purple Heart, that was one of the weirder experiences of my life.
Everyday occurrence, no.
I know our curators probably got some interesting stories about random materials in the post office. But yes.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, that's a lot of stuff gets shipped through the world. That's just strange. Yeah, so that. Let's see. How do I want to go about describing that? It's his only war trophy. He didn't bring anything else home. I think there's some real disconnect there. If you ever want to read the sequel to Slaughterhouse-Five, if I were you, I'd read Bluebeard. He does talk in detail about what it was like to see the high and mighty German army crumble and watch these people desperately begging to be taken prisoner, and they didn't really know what they were supposed to be doing. There was an obvious sense that the Germans understood that if they were captured by the Americans as just general rank and file, they weren't going to be suffering super heavy consequences, and that if they were captured by the Soviet Union, they were going to suffer unbearable consequences. So yeah, if you get to the very, very literal description of the experiences in Slaughterhouse-Five, you can understand that I think Vonnegut was just kind of walking around a daydream towards the end there. I'm surprised he had the wherewithal to grab the sword, because if you read that letter home to his family, it sounds like he's writing a narrative from like another galaxy or something along those lines.
Yeah, that really gives you good, background for where his mental state was during that time. I know we're running out of time, but I think one of the other last topics I was trying to get to was the fact that it was a banned book for a long time in different schools, all the way up until recently. I know, Kim, you mentioned like 2011, there was even a challenge for it somewhere. So, yeah, what do y'all know about its experiences being, a controversial text?
Well, I think the censors got a hold of it right away, because in 1969, with the Vietnam divide, half the country is shoveling this book into their schools and libraries as aggressively as they can, and the other half is throwing it in incinerators as fast as they can and holding public book burnings. We know the primary one that we know of took place in Drake, North Dakota, in what I believe was 1971. It may have been 73. But Vonnegut wrote a letter to the head of the school board, which wasn't published for another 7 or 8 years or something along those lines, where he writes very, very eloquently about how you have insulted me. I am an American veteran. I have raised 3 children of my own, 4 children of my sister. She died of cancer in '58. Her husband was killed in a train accident 48 hours previously. I mean, this is a guy who, you read the book, it's easy to kind of in your mind picture a hippie exploring psychedelics, but what you have instead is a 46-year-old man who has raised many children, has been there for every family thing, like just has participated in the American experience to the absolute fullest, and he was just livid. And with a vocabulary like what Vonnegut had, he tears this guy a new one, and he did not release it to the public. This was personal to him. for a very long time because he felt that Slaughterhouse-Five wasn't arguing for anything wild or inappropriate. It was arguing for a better society through Vonnegut's way of looking at the world. I remember when, like, if you look at him as like an activist, there's so much sarcasm in his work that it's hard to like say he was a positive activist, but he was an activist in his own way. That line about anti-glacier novel, it's sometimes hard to sell that one.
It also makes me think about when Billy Pilgrim is in the hospital, and that old historian is in the bed next to him, and is kind of, sort of, blowing him off or whatever. And when he brings up Dresden, the whole story, Billy Pilgrim seems kind of like aloof, but in that one moment, he's serious. He's like, I was there, and that's the one thing that snaps him out of, everything else. I wonder if Kurt probably also took it personally,
It's a super personal thing. I can't even fathom it. It's so weird that we get, we've had thousands and thousands of people come through this building. Vonnegut didn't always create a ton of fair weather fans. And so when we get Vonnegut fanatics in here with the Vonnegut tattoos everywhere, it's pretty rare that they list Slaughterhouse-Five as their favorite. And I always wonder how much of it is like the truth of the novel is sometimes hard to bear versus the humor, which is very funny, but it's just a very, very real book. And, you can read Sirens of Titan and take it as fiction. You can read Cat's Cradle and take it as fiction. Even parts of Breakfast of Champions and Slapstick, even though there's tons of Vonnegut in all those novels. But Slaughterhouse-Five, for some reason, just has the capacity to hit a nerve. And I think Vonnegut had to expose a nerve in order to write it.
That's a good way to put it. Excellent, man. It looks like we've got a few minutes left. I was definitely going to have each of y'all maybe talk about some stuff in the collections, and then Chris give you a chance to talk about the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and some of the stuff they've done with Slaughterhouse-Five. But Kim, some materials here that might be of interest to a Vonnegut fan or someone interested in the POW experience.
Some of my favorite items in the collection are some of our diaries that were kept by prisoners of war, and these were men who were able to write while captive. So typically they were officers and not required to work like Vonnegut, but we do have a couple of diaries from men who were on work detachments. We also have diaries from, we have one diary from a British airman who was in Stalag Luft 1, and he was held captive for quite a long time. And, reading his story, his name was Olaf Lambert, reading his story is a lot like the British POWs in Slaughterhouse-Five. There are actually photographs in his diary from his time in camp where they had a big Christmas meal. So those images, that diary is digitized and it can be seen online on our website, guestofthethird-reich.org. So we can type that in the chat. But it is, it can be flipped through. So that's one thing that I think is interesting to review in light of that particular story.
Perfect. And I'm glad you referenced that website that I know you put together for that exhibit some years ago, Guests of the Third Reich. It's linked in the chat right now for anyone watching, and also it's linked on our the book club's Goodreads page. It's got a cool interactive map, videos from the time, those scanned diaries. So do check that out, y'all. And then Chris, you want to tell us a little bit more about the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library and some stuff y'all are up to?
Well, we've got a 3-floor building that we purchased in 2019. We had to raise $1.5 million in about 45 days, and that was a long time. It was wild. So we have a freedom of expression exhibit on our first floor that deals with censorship issues. We have an exhibit that relates to the 2011 challenge in Republic, Missouri, where a college professor who was homeschooling his own children was so offended the local school library had Slaughterhouse-Five that he demanded to be removed. And they did, and so we'd only been a museum for about 6 months. We started sending free copies of Slaughterhouse-Five to kids in the area who wanted to read it. So that was pretty wild. We've got a recreation of Vonneguts workspace from the 50s and 60s. Up on the second floor, which is where I am right now, I am actually in our Youth Writers Center, which we're going to be opening relatively soon. There's a Curtin, Indiana exhibit having to do with his family. We got yearbooks and pictures from his childhood. We've got an event center with a bunch of Vonnegut's artwork. Vonnegut was always very into drawing and painting, but in 1993 he met a guy named Joe Petro based out of Lexington, Kentucky, and he was doing screen prints with him. He would paint pictures on acetate, and Joe would screen print them, and then Kurt would sign them in pencil. His signature, of course, includes his famous drawing of an asshole. It's very renowned.
Love it.
And then up on the third floor, we have a Slaughterhouse-Five specific exhibit, which I've done a video tour of, and we've made some changes to it in the last month or so, but it's still pretty accurate.
Awesome. I'm glad you referenced that Slaughterhouse-Five virtual tour, y'all. We linked to it on the Goodreads page as well, and you can go to the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library site, and Chris will walk you through some of the high points of that exhibit. So it's like you're there. You don't even have to go to Indianapolis, although I would certainly encourage you. And certainly come to New Orleans to see us when things are safe,
Yeah, I told my wife last night, actually, I was like, I'm hoping I make a good impression on the World War II Museum people, because I can't wait to go to New Orleans again. I've never done it with family and children in tow, but I'm still pretty psyched to do it.
We would look forward to hosting you whenever this is, whenever it's safe to do so again. And likewise, I can't wait to visit the Kurt Vonnegut Museum and check out Indianapolis. So,
yeah, traveling exhibit, I'd be happy to send it your way.
Oh, that would be excellent. Perfect. Okay, I think we've about reached our, limit here. I don't know if we got any questions from any participants. Chrissy, I don't know if.
Yeah, it looks like no questions now. So yeah, I think y'all can wrap it on up.
Okay. Well, any closing, parting comments from Kim, Chris?
It's been a pleasure. I mean, Slaughterhouse-Five is one of my all-time favorites. Well,
and you have a Vonnegut story, right, Kim?
Oh, I did pass Vonnegut on the sidewalk in Northampton, Massachusetts. Probably in around 1990, in the late 90s. Let's just leave it at that. And, brushed by him, and he was, elaborately dressed for the winter, with some kind of nice long striped scarf. And I was just too starstruck, and I regret that moment. If I could go back in time, at least speak with him, tell him how much I admired his work. But yeah.
Well, you certainly at least had a brush with, with genius there, and that's something for sure. That's cool.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, Chris.
Yeah, I recommend that everybody come here and visit. I've been here 10 years. I mean, we have a really cool collection, and our tours are awesome. And it's, I think Vonnegut made people happy. There was something about his sense of humor that made life a little bit easier to get through. And yeah, I think I enjoy really spreading that around.
Well said, man. And that is exactly why I think we all enjoy him so much. And I got to say thank you, Chris, for joining us from up there and taking the time. And Kim, certainly the same for you. I know how crazy busy we all are here. But anyway, thanks again, y'all. And I guess that wraps it for this one. Be looking for our next book club event next month. Thanks,
yeah, and if you recorded this, please share the link with me, and I'll get it up on our social media.
Perfect. Thank you. And yes, we will have this recording posted, and I will make sure to share it with Kurt Vonnegut Museum and Library, and it'll be on our museum's pages as well. So look for that. And thanks again for joining us, y'all.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.